grab your Bible and open up to 1 Corinthians chapter 7. 1 Corinthians chapter 7. A little light this morning. Maybe we'll have some folks coming in as we get started here just a little bit. So for several weeks we've been talking about we've been studying 1 Corinthians is what we've been really studying. But it's kind of through the lens of solving problems God's way. And so when we think about the church, no church is going to be perfect on this side of heaven. Now the church in heaven, ultimately, yes, is absolutely going to be perfect. But the church, as long as we're on the earth, there's going to be some problems. We're going to have issues. And when we start thinking about the things we work through in this life, we got to do it the way God wants us to. We got to solve our problems God's way. And really, there's no better example for us to look at if we're talking about gaining in our strengths, fixing our weaknesses, than looking at the church in Corinth. The church in Corinth had all kinds of troubles. I like the way Jalen calls it. It's the hot mess church, right? Every single chapter in the book details some sort of a problem of some kind, and then instructions of how to fix that problem. Well, this morning what we're going to be looking at is we're going to be looking at 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and the problem of marriage. And not just the problem of marriage, but some really good marital tips that we're going to pull out of 1 Corinthians chapter 7 this morning. And really, the Bible is God's marriage manual. I mean, if you want to have a perfect marriage, you go to the Bible. The Bible will tell you everything you need to know about being a husband, everything you need to know about being a wife. Every problem you could ever have between a husband and a wife can be solved by going to the Word, going to the Bible. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7, it's a great passage that gives us a lot of nuggets of truth as it pertains to the workings of marriage. But at the same time, 1 Corinthians chapter 7 is also a chapter that so many people have gone to try to support some false teachings. And so we'll talk about that a little bit this morning too. So let's just begin. What we're going to do is we're going to walk our way through this chapter, and we're going to break it down into its sections of thought. And so there's multiple sections of a complete thought. In fact, about 5 complete thoughts that Paul gives throughout the whole chapter of chapter 7. So, number 1, he gives instructions for physical relationships in marriage. And that's going to be verses 1 through 5. So, number 1, Paul gives instructions to married couples in the physical relationship that they have in their marriage. Verses 1 through 5. Let's look at those verses together. Casey, Gene, let's start with you. Will you read verses 1 through 5 for me, please?
Chapter 7?
Yes, chapter 7.
Okay. Since we have these promises, dear friends, let us purify ourselves from everything that contaminates body and spirit, perfecting holiness out of the reverence for God. Make room for us in your heart. We have wronged no one. We have corrupted no one. We have exploited no one. I do not say this to condemn you. I have said before that you have such a place in our heart.
Is that 1 Corinthians chapter 7?
I'm in 2 Corinthians.
Oh, okay, I was fixing to say, I was hanging in there for a second. I was like, that doesn't sound right.
I was reading good.
Okay. Yeah, that was great reading.
Yeah. Let me get started over here at the right place. Alright, here we go. Now for the matters you wrote about. Is this it? Now for the matters you wrote about. It is good for a man not to marry, but since there is so much immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. The husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. The wife's body does not belong to her alone, but also to her husband. In the same way, the husband's body does not belong to him alone, but also to his wife. Do not deprive each other except by mutual consent and for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer. Then come together again, so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control.
All right, first things first. The first thing that we learn in this section right here verses 1 through 5, Paul giving instructions to the physical nature of marriage, is we learn that sex is confined to a marriage. We understand that according to these verses right here. And we live in a society where there is all sorts of sexual activity outside of the marriage. And I've even heard people say, well, it doesn't say that you can't. I have had a young couple tell me that the Bible doesn't say you can't have sex outside of marriage. I'm sorry, the Bible doesn't say that you shouldn't do something for you to not do it. Again, like we talked about the other night, the Bible is not a book of don'ts. What I mean by that is the Bible does not tell you everything you can't do. If that's the case, the Bible would be about that high off the ground, it would be about that thick. Rather, it tells you what you must do. There are some don'ts in the Bible, but it tells you what you must do. Look at verse 2. It says, because of immoralities, let each man have his own wife. Let each woman have her own husband. Have in the biblical sense, in the physical sense, meaning a wife has the authority to have her husband, and the husband has the authority to, quote-unquote, have his wife. Anything else is outside of what God wanted. It's it. It's just like there's people that say that Jesus never spoke on homosexuality. Now we see Paul speaking on homosexuality, completely condemns it. Says homosexuals shall not enter the kingdom of heaven. Pretty cut and dry. But people will actually say, well, Jesus never spoke on it. Yes, he did. Matthew chapter 19, where God created them male and female. Anything else is outside of what God said. And it's the same thing right here in verse 2. A wife is to have her husband. A husband is to have her wife. Meaning that is the realm in which God created them. In fact, you go back to Genesis chapter 1, where he creates mankind. It says it's not good for man to be alone. And he creates woman. And he says, this is now bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. And because of that, he says, the two shall become one flesh. Man and wife become one flesh. Anything else outside of that is not authorized by God. We see that very clearly right here in verse 2. And in fact, if you want to underline verse 2, and right out to the side, Hebrews 13:4. Hebrews 13:4 says, marriage is to be held in honor among all. Let the marriage bed be undefiled. For fornicators and adulterers, God will judge. Marriage bed. That's it. That is where God authorized the physical activity between a man and a wife. It's in the marriage bed. So that's the first thing we learn. Number 2, in this section here, these first 5 verses, we learn that physical selflessness is a responsibility of both parties. In fact, if you look there in verse 4, Gene's version in verse 4 says the wife does not, does not have the ability to choose. Is that what your version said?
My body does not belong to her alone.
Does not belong. Okay, so I assume that does not belong is the same word for my version that says authority. My version says the wife does not have authority, be the same Greek word. That's actually the opposite of the Greek word you find in chapter 8 and verse 9 of this same book. Chapter 8 and verse 9, Paul's talking about eating meat sacrificed to idols. And he says, in that, I have liberty. Meaning, I can literally make a choice. That is the opposite words you find here in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 4. Meaning, you don't have a choice. Now, here's the thing. Wives don't have a choice over their own body. They don't have authority over their own body. But who also doesn't have authority over their own body? The husband doesn't either. Okay? That does not give the authority for one party to force themselves onto the other party. That's not what that verse is saying. The purpose of that verse is found in verse 5. In verse 5. Stop depriving each other because of temptation. Devote yourselves to God, but make sure that Satan is not coming into the marriage through the open door of sexual temptation. Yes, ma'am.
This version here says the wife gives authority over her body to her husband, and the husband gives authority over his body to his wife.
Right. Yes.
Giving.
Exactly. And so that right there speaks of the selfless nature of that verse that Paul's trying to get at. It doesn't mean that the wife has no authority over her body. and the man can just force himself on his wife anytime that he wants to, and she doesn't have a choice. That's not what that verse is getting at. What that verse is speaking of is exactly what Sylvia just mentioned. It speaks of the selfless nature of the marriage bed for the purpose of making sure that sexual temptation does not come into the marriage. That's the purpose of it. Yes?
And it goes further in verse 6 to clarify it's concession, not command.
Yes. So, which brings us to our next section. So let's go ahead and get into our next section here. Multiple times, and I got to tee this up a little bit. Multiple times in this chapter, you're going to hear Paul say, I give confession, not command. I give my opinion, not command. And he'll even say later on, he'll say, it is I that says to you, not the Lord. Okay? That's something to keep in mind in this whole chapter. Okay? Because we're going to be dealing with things that seem contradictory at first if we don't understand exactly what Paul is talking about. So yes, thank you, Zach, for that very much. Look at our section. So first section, number 1, he gives instructions for the physical nature of marriage. Number 2, he gives instructions to the unmarried and to widows. This is verses 6 through 9. Casey, will you read 6 through 9, please, sir?
But I say this as a concession, not as a commandment. For I wish that all men were even as I myself, that each one has his own gift from God, one in this manner and another in that. But I say to the unmarried and to the widows, it is good for them if they remain even as I am. But if they cannot exercise self-control, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion.
All right, there you go. So verse 9 again. You may want to underline verse 9 there and reference verse 2. That the sexual relationship between a man and a woman is intended for only the married. Okay? Only those in marriage have the authority, have the right to have physical relationships with each other. Anything outside of marriage, God does not authorize. Very clear in verse 2, 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 2. And again, 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 9. If they do not have self-control, let them marry. For it is better to marry than to burn. And so, again, speaking of the nature of sex outside of marriage is not authorized by God. It is better to marry than to burn. And so, verse 6 through 9 there, he gives it an instruction. And again, he begins this instruction in verse 6, like Zach said, I give concession, not a command. Now, what did God tell Adam and Eve? What's one of the first things he tells them? Be fruitful and multiply. All right, so does God want you to be married and have kids? Yes. That is a design of the marriage by God. He wants you to be married and he wants you to have children. Okay? So why is it that Paul says now, it's better if you're not married? Is that a contradiction of God's command, of God's will? Yes, sir.
No, I mean, there's a ton of humans already, but I mean, so just like Jesus, Jesus never married, he never,
Sure.
those desires, he never, so, God wants us to live as perfect as humanly possible, to include undefiling ourselves, because our body, do you not know that your body is a temple of God?
That's right.
So to commit sexual immorality would be worse than a Levitical priest carrying a harlot into the Holy of Holies of the actual temple. And we know this because of the days of Balaam or whatever, the Israelite servant sent the spirit through the harlot.
Zeal of Phinehas.
Right.
Yeah.
And he was accounted for righteousness.
That's right. Because he was zealous with God's zeal, is what it says there. Yes.
I feel like it's more so like clarifying, because going back to what you said before, be fruitful and multiply.
Sure.
I feel like this is more of a clarification, not just with anybody.
Sure.
You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
Kind of like the Old and New Testament, do not commit adultery, and in the New Testament, if you even look upon another woman.
That's right. That's right. So yes. God wants us to be fruitful and multiply. This is not a contradiction. But you also got to take into account the context of the culture and the context of the times, which we're going to see an allusion to here in just a little bit when he starts talking about present distresses. Okay. What year what general year, decade is 1 Corinthians written in? You're looking at 50 to 60 AD. Okay? What are some present distresses that Christians in the first century are about to really, really undergo? Persecution from Rome, being dragged out of their own homes into the gladiator ring, burned at the stake for Nero's orgy parties. There was some extreme persecution that was going on, and Paul's saying, look, it is better because of the present distresses for you to be focused on God and doing His will. And that also has to play in it as well. We'll look at that context here in just a second. So he gives advice. He says, look, it is better for you to remain unmarried. Because if you're unmarried, you can wholly dedicate yourself to God. That kind of sets up a little bit of the rest of the chapter. A little bit. He kind of vacillates back and forth between giving instructions. But this concept right here, it is better to remain unmarried so that you can be wholly dedicated to the Lord. That concept is really going to be echoed throughout the rest of the chapter. So keep that in the back of your mind. Okay? Only if you can control yourself, by the way. Verse 9, it says, if you do not have control, let them marry. It's better to marry, not to burn. Section number 3 here that he gives instructions to husbands and wives. So number 3, he gives instructions to husbands and wives in verses 10 and 11. Garland, will you read verse 10 and 11 for me, please?
All right. Now to the married, I command, yet not I, but the Lord. A wife is not to depart from her husband, but even if she does depart, let her remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband. And the husband is not to divorce his wife.
Alright, this time he makes it clear. Okay? So before he said, I give concession, not command. This time what does he say? He said, not I, but who?
The Lord.
The Lord. The Lord. You may want to underline not I, but the Lord, and write out to the side Matthew chapter 19. Matthew chapter 19. In Matthew 19, that is the Lord giving the command that a man should not divorce his wife for any reason except that of fornication. And the Greek word for fornication is the actual physical act between a man and a woman, or a woman and a man, outside of marriage. That word for accept in Matthew chapter 19 is actually the exact same word for accept in John chapter 3 verse 5. Truly I say to you, unless or except one is born of water and spirit, he shall not get into the kingdom of heaven. So literally, you cannot accept this one thing. That's what that word means. So as far as divorce is concerned, no divorce is authorized by God except for this one thing. And that one thing is when the bonds of marriage are broken in a physical relationship outside of that marriage. That's the one thing. And so when Paul says right here in verse 10, not I, but the Lord, he's talking about Matthew chapter 19 and Matthew chapter 5. Both times Jesus was very clear that the wife should not leave her husband. And vice versa. The husband should not leave his wife. If she does leave, let her remain unmarried, or else be reconciled to her husband. And that the husband should not send his wife away. Okay? Then, Paul moves on and gives instructions to husbands and wives who are, or people who are married to a non-believer. Okay? So number 1, he gives instructions, verses 1 through 5, of the physical nature of marriage. Number 2, he gives instructions to the unmarried and the widows, verses 6 through 9. 10 and 11, he gives instructions to husbands and wives, meaning if you separate, if you leave, you're to remain unmarried. Then he gives instructions in this section, number 4, to husbands and wives who are married to non-believers. That's going to be verses 12 through 16, if you're taking notes. Verses 12 through 16. Clayton, will you read verses 12 through 16 for me, please?
But to the rest I say, not the Lord, that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever, and she consents to live with him, he must not divorce her. And a woman who has an unbelieving husband, and he consents to live with her, she must not send her husband away. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified through her believing husband. For otherwise your children are unclean, but now they are holy. Yet if the unbelieving one us to peace.
All right. So first things first, I want you to notice, we're going to learn 3 things or 4 things from this section of Scripture together, this verses 12 through 16. Number 1, putting away the unbeliever is not necessary. Putting away the unbeliever is not necessary. Go back to verse 12. I say to the rest, he says, I say, not the Lord, right? So this time, he makes it very clear. In verse 10, he says, this isn't me talking, this is the Lord talking. The Lord is commanding you that you cannot leave your husband or wife except for the cause of fornication or unchastity, Matthew chapter 19. And then right here he says, this is me speaking, not the Lord, meaning I give you my opinion. Verse 12 he says, if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever and she consents to live with him, let him not send her away. And there's a lot of relationships that we see in the church where somebody comes by themselves all the time. I know of a family in West Texas where the husband is a vehement, not an atheist, what's the other one? Agnostic, thank you. He's agnostic, okay? Unapologetically, unwilling to move, which agnostic is basically like, we don't really know if there is a God, but we don't really know that there's not a God, and so just in case, I'm going to go ahead and say that there is a God, but we can't really know that there is a God, and so therefore we just don't know, but I'm going to say there is a God. That way, just in case there is a God, I get to go to heaven. That's basically the agnostic view in a nutshell. Okay? Makes absolutely no sense. That is her husband. This woman has 3 kids, and she is one of the most faithful people you will ever see in your life. When the doors are open, that girl and her children do not miss a service. Not even just that, outside of Sundays and Wednesdays, Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, if there's anything going on in the church, her and her kids are there every single time. And she has raised some amazing, faithful children with an unbelieving husband. And she's always there by herself, her and her kids. And she's a great example for a lot of people. Was a great example for me and my wife for a long time of what it takes, not just with an unbelieving husband, but in a marriage where you're trying to figure each other out and lift each other up spiritually. You can look at her and see how much work she does for her kids, just herself. And sometimes in a marriage, we put that off on our spouse, don't we? How come you don't do more with the kids? How come you don't do Bible time with the kids? When we need to look at ourselves and say, I need to be doing more with the kids. So she was a great example of me. And this verse right here speaks to her. And speaks to her nature of willing to stay in the marriage for the sake of trying to save her husband. Now, that's what we learned, number 1, is that the putting away is not necessary. Okay? Number 2, marriage is still considered to be holy. Go back to the verse. Go back to the verse, verse 14. The unbelieving husband is sanctified through his wife. The unbelieving wife is sanctified through her believing husband. Okay, pause for just a second. What does it mean to be sanctified? What does that word even mean? What's that? To be made holy. Yes. It's the same word for holy, sanctification. It's sanctify is the root word there, and it's the word to be holy. And so when you think about it, it says the wife is sanctified through her husband. The husband is sanctified through her wife. They're made holy. Okay? Does that mean a husband can go to wife if he go to heaven? A husband can go to heaven if he just rides the spiritual nature of his wife? No, the spiritual coattails of his wife, I guess I should say. No. If you got a wife who is so dedicated to the Lord, and you got a deadbeat husband who just never even shows up to anything, he can't expect to go to heaven because of his wife's work and his wife's faith. That's not how marriage works. That's not how salvation works. And so when he says that the unbelieving husband is sanctified through the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified through the husband, we're not talking about a sanctification of your salvation. We're talking about a sanctification of the marriage. God says the marriage is to be holy. Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 4. Marriage is to be held in honor among all, and the marriage bed is to be undefiled. God looks at marriage and He sees it as a holy union. He looks at a marriage, even of somebody who is between a believing wife and an unbelieving husband, and sees that still as a holy that believe that marriage, biblical marriage, the instructions for it are only given to Christians. Meaning for people outside the church, biblical marriage doesn't apply. God looks at all marriages and sees all of them as something He sanctified, as something that He made, and as something that He deemed as to be held holy. Think about John the Baptist. In Mark chapter 6, John the Baptist was arrested. Does anybody remember who he was arrested by? And he was eventually going to be beheaded by? It was Herod Antipas. Okay? Herod Antipas. This would be the nephew of Herod the Great. Okay? So Herod Antipas, who's eventually going to behead John the Baptist. But John the Baptist, having the spirit of Elijah, being the guy that he was, he didn't hold anything back. Right? Herod Antipas had stolen his brother's wife, Philip. John the Baptist looked at Herod Antipas, and do you know what he told Herod Antipas? He said, "It is not lawful for you to have her. You can't have her." Was Herod Antipas and his wife, Herodias, were they even close to being good, faithful Jews? He was about to take the head off of John the Baptist not too long after you read about that incident in Mark chapter 6. These are not Christians. These are not faithful Jews. These are people that you would consider heathens, pagans, outside of God. And yet John the Baptist looked at their marriage and said, "It is not lawful for you to have her." God's laws of marriage applies to everybody, in or out of the church. That's made very clear in the Bible. In fact, in Matthew chapter 19, when Jesus is talking about marriage and divorce, He takes the argument all the way back to creation. That supersedes all law and goes back to the law of nature and of creation and said, God made them male and female. What God has joined together, what? Let no man separate. That's exactly right. And so the laws of marriage apply to everybody inside and outside of the church. All right. Number 3. We learn that a Christian is not under, quote unquote, under bondage if they leave. Go back to verse 15. Verse 15 says, "Yet if the unbelieving one leaves, let him leave. The brother or the sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God has called us to peace." Okay, so this right here, this verse right here, is what a lot of people call the Pauline privilege. So Jesus Christ in Matthew chapter 5 and Matthew chapter 19 says, nobody can separate, nobody is allowed to divorce except for the case of fornication, which is the actual physical act of sex outside of marriage. He says that's the only reason that a man and a wife can separate. Right here, Paul says, if the unbelieving husband or the unbelieving wife leaves, that brother or sister is not under bondage anymore. If Paul is saying under bondage there, as in the bonds of marriage, then that is a direct contradiction of Jesus' words. And so it simply just can't mean that. By the way, a great Bible study tactic is to look at a Bible verse that may be seemingly confusing at first and say, okay, what can it not mean? Okay? What does it not mean? Well, he doesn't contradict Jesus. Under bondage there is not speaking of the bonds of marriage. In fact, hold your finger in verse 15. Look at the word under bondage in verse 15. And now skip down to verse 39 of the same chapter. Garland, will you read verse 39?
The wife is bound by law as long as her husband lives.
Pause. Bound. Bondage. The Greek word for bound in verse 39 is a completely different Greek word for bound and bondage in verse 15. All throughout the New Testament, you see the word in verse 39 used of the marriage. It's a bond. It's a connection between two people. If you took two things and you tied them together or welded them together, that's the word you would use to bond something together. That's why it's bondo, right? You take two things and you put bondo between them and you bound them together, right? Now, the word for bondage in verse 15, under bondage, is literally slavery. Now, hang on a second. I'm not making a joke here. I'm not saying that the marriage is slavery. Although sometimes it may feel like that, right? Between a husband and wife. Sometimes it feels like slavery. And that's okay. But that's never described in the Bible. Marriage is never described as slavery, even though it may feel that way sometimes. It's not described as slavery. Nowhere in the Bible. So the bonds in verse 15, number one, can't contradict Jesus' words in Matthew 5 and Matthew 19. And number two, the nature of the word bondage is speaking of slavery in such cases. Therefore, the interpretation of verse 15 is not that anytime somebody wants to leave, let them go and y'all can just be divorced. That's not what that passage is meaning. Rather, it means that if you have an unbelieving spouse, get the context. We're not talking about any old husband and wife. An unbelieving husband, an unbelieving wife, somebody who's pagan, doesn't even believe in God. When that person leaves, you are not under the bondage of their rule or their authority or their opinion in marriage anymore. So think about it this way. This is basically what Paul's saying. Say you got a wife who's a Christian, and you got a husband who doesn't even believe in God. And he's telling her all the time, I don't want you to go to church. But then he leaves her. Guess what? Guess who she doesn't have to listen to anymore? The unbelieving husband. That's what that person's speaking of. Yes, Gene.
What's also important here is that only the unbeliever can leave, not the believer.
Yes. Thank you, Peter. Yes. Just because there's strife in a marriage doesn't mean that the wife can just up and leave at any time. If the husband consents, and you got to take that back to the verse there, back in verse 12. I say to the rest, not the Lord, that if any brother has a wife who's an unbeliever, she consents to live with him, let him not send her away. So yes, should stay together. Should hold, and look at the purpose. That we look number 4. We see the purpose of it. Look at the purpose in verse 14. Look at the back half of verse 14. For otherwise your children are unclean, but now they're holy. A child needs a mom, and a child needs a dad. That's just the nature of the way that God made it. That's why homosexual marriages who adopt children usually create monsters. Usually create really, really bad things that go on out, bad children that go on out into society and cause some major, major problems. Why? Because God made the marriage. God made it male and female. God designed it. Mankind's the one that came in and took it and said, well, let's experiment with this and that. God made it male and female, and a child very much needs a mom, and a child very much needs a dad. Very clear from the beginning of time. And so, yes, you should stay together to try to make your children holy. And verse 15 states the purpose as well. If the unbelieving he leaves... verse 16. How do you know, O wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, O husband, whether you will save your wife? So you should stick together for the purpose of trying to save the wife or save the husband. It's kind of like a Bible study. When do you stop Bible studying with somebody? When they tell you they don't want a Bible study with you anymore. Even if it's the most frustrating Bible study in the world, you still study with that person until they shut the door and say, don't come in. But as long as that door's open, you go study with them. Same concept. All right. Number 5. And I've got 10 minutes to cover probably one of the most controversial texts in all of the New Testament as it relates to marriage, divorce, and remarriage. Let's just get into it. All right. Verses 17 through 40 is one big, complete thought. Verses 17 through 40 is one complete thought. And he begins this complete thought by stating, look at verse 17, only as the Lord has assigned to each one, as God has called each, in this manner let him walk. And thus I direct in all the churches. So the command is this. In the state in which you're called, remain. In the state in which you're called, remain in that state. Okay? That is the directive. And that's this section, 17 through 40. Number 5, this is where we're talking about. Paul gives instructions to married couples. He gives instructions in abiding in our present state. Well, number one, he states the directive very clear. And in fact, he states it 5 times. Okay, follow with me. Number one, he states it in verse 17. I just read it. Number 2, skip down to verse 20. Each man must remain in the condition in which he was called. Number 3, he states it in verse 24. Skip down to verse 24. Each one is to remain with God in the condition in which he was called. Look at verse 26. I think then that it's good in view of the present distress, that's the context, present distress, that it's good for a man to remain as he is. And then number 5, lastly, verse 40. In my opinion, she is happier if she remains as she is, and I think that also I have the Spirit of God. So 5 times, Paul states the directive. Paul states the instruction. Let a man remain in the state in which he was called. Okay, so keep that in the back of your mind. That's the command. Okay? He gives 6 examples of the command. 6 examples of the command. Number 1, he gives circumcision. Look at verses 18 and 19. Was a man called already circumcised? Let him not be uncircumcised. Was he called uncircumcised? Let him not be circumcised. Okay? So he gives the example of circumcision, verses 18 to 19. Number 2, he gives the examples of slaves, verses 21 through 23. Are you a slave? Don't seek to be free. Are you free? Don't become a slave. Yes, Gene?
On the first one, is he not saying that if you're a Jew,
Yes.
you can't deny
You
it?
can- because if
you
you're-
have to deny being a Jew. If you are not a Jew, you don't have to be a Jew to be a Christian.
Well, and that's well, true. I mean, he's speaking more of an example more than anything because Jews at that time would be sin, and so he's not saying if you're circumcised, don't become circumcised. He's not talking in the nature of a Jew, because then that would be, if you're a Jew, don't become a Christian. That's basically what he would be saying. He's just giving this as an example of, if you're this, don't become that. If you're circumcised,
You can become a Christian, but you can't deny your Jewish heritage.
well, the purpose of it. So right here, he gives the purpose of it. So look at verse 19. Circumcision is nothing. Uncircumcision is nothing. What matters is the keeping of the commandments of God. And so that's what he's saying. He's giving an example, an extreme example, just to point to the fact that all that matters is keeping the commandments of God. So circumcision. Circumcised, uncircumcised, doesn't matter. Keep the commandments of God. Slavery, free or slave, doesn't matter. Keep the commands of God. The third section, the third example he gives is in verse 25 and 26 of a virgin. If you're a virgin, stay a virgin. If not a virgin, stay married. Verse 27 and 35, he gives an instruction of example of being unmarried. He talks about if you're married, stay married. If you're unmarried, stay unmarried. He gives examples in number 5 of fathers to their daughters, verses 36 through 38. If you've got a daughter and she needs to get married, let her get married. If you've got a daughter and you don't want her to get married, don't let her get married. And then finally, number 6, he gives examples to widows. Are you a widow? Remain a widow. Do you need to get married? Get married. He gives these examples as it relates to the command. Again, what was the command? Each person stay as they are. Each person is to remain in the state that they're called. And he gives 6 examples of that. Are you circumcised? Don't become uncircumcised. Are you slave? Don't become free. Are you a virgin? Don't marry. Are you married? Don't leave your wife. Are you unmarried? No reason to get married. Fathers, if you give your daughter away, it doesn't matter. That's the purpose. The purpose is very clearly laid out. So the command is given, stay in the state in which you're called. The examples are given, circumcised, slaves, virgins, unmarried, widows. And then the purpose is very clearly stated. Go to verse 19. We read the purpose already in verse 19. Circumcision is nothing, uncircumcision is nothing. But what matters is the keeping of the commandments of God. Number 2, second example, look at verse 21. The purpose is stated very clear. Were you called while a slave? Do not worry about it. Don't be concerned about those things. What matters is the keeping of the commandments of God. Next, look at verse 32. I want you to be free from concern. One who is unmarried is concerned about the things of the Lord, how he may please the Lord. Now skip down to verse 35. This I say for your own benefit, not to put a restraint upon you, but to promote what is appropriate and to secure undistracted devotion to the Lord. Okay. So what is Paul talking about in all of this? Because it kind of gets a little confusing and convoluted for just a minute. He says each man is to remain in the state in which you're called. He specifically mentions a present distress. He says, given the present distress, remain in the state in which you're called. Because none of it matters. It doesn't matter if you're circumcised or not. It doesn't matter if you're married or not. Stay in that state. Why? Verse 35, so that he can secure undistracted devotion towards God. That's why. It's actually a pretty easy concept to understand. These things in life don't really all matter all that much. Can you go to heaven if you're not married? Can you go to heaven if you're married? Then does marriage really matter at the end of the day? No, it doesn't. Can you go to heaven if you're a widow? Can you go to heaven if you were a widow and you become married? Yes. In the first century, can you go to married if you're a slave or free? Can you go to heaven if you're circumcised or uncircumcised? None of these things matter. All that matters is the keeping of the commandment of the Lord. And so Paul says in verse 35, I'm just trying to secure undevoted, undistracted attention and devotion to God. That's the purpose. The problem with this section of text is that people read into it and they say, well, this is a perfect example of if you were married, divorced, and remarried improperly, you can just stay in that state. People that use this verse, this section of Scripture, to prop that example up are adding something that's just simply not there. Nowhere in the text here does it ever say anything about an improper, unauthorized marriage. It doesn't say it there. And so what you're doing for people that do that is you take this principle, remain in the state in which you're called. These things don't matter. All that matters is keeping the commandments of God. I'm just trying to secure undevoted, undistracted attention to the Lord. You take that concept and you overlay it on top of marriage, divorce, remarriage and say, well, can I take this principle of remaining in the state in which I was called and overlay it on top of marriage, divorce, remarriage unscripturally? And when you do that, does it make sense? Well, if you take that concept and overlay it on top of polygamy, can you just remain in that state? If I had 5 wives before I became a Christian, can I keep all 5 of them? Remain in the present state in which I was called. If you were in a homosexual marriage before becoming a Christian, are you to remain in that state in which you were called of being in a homosexual marriage after? Absolutely not. If you are in a marriage of any kind that God does not authorize, can you just remain in that state in which you were called after becoming a Christian? And the answer is no. It's as simple as that. And so this passage, this section of Scripture, many people take this section and they prop it up as an example and say, see, I can remain in this state. Jesus Christ does not give authority for remarriage except for the case of unchastity, unfaithfulness in the marriage. Yes, Casey?
It always goes back to people not. Put some of that away.
Sure.
I mean, you can't take that and try to place that and then go back to chapter 6, where he says, do not know that righteous will not inherit the kingdom of God. And this fornicators and adulterers and this.
Yes.
And he said, some of them, you used to be some of those, but you were what? You were clean, you were sanctified.
Yes.
So you stopped whatever you were doing and you put that away.
Yes, absolutely.
That's always how it is.
Yes, absolutely. See, sin before is sin after. And again, to go back to John the Baptist and him speaking to Herod Antipas, God authorizes or recognizes marriage laws outside of being in a relationship with God. And so he looked at Herod Antipas and said, it's not lawful for you to have your wife. Herod Antipas was not a child of God. Herod Antipas was not a faithful Jew, a faithful Israelite. He was a pagan. He was a heathen. He was about to take John the Baptist's head off. And yet, there was still a recognition of the laws of marriage. outside of that. And so the laws of marriage apply outside the church every bit as much as they apply inside the church. So yes. All right, we're a couple minutes past. We better stop there. Thank you all so much for listening this morning. We'll have a worship service here in about 15 minutes.